if we can change the way that we're electing our officials, and we're no longer us versus them, we know that our voice is counted and that our vote is represented proportionally, then we don't need to us versus them. I am Andrew MacGregor, candidate for the Green Party of Canada. I am running for office for my kids, really. When the call came to me, Andrew, would you like to do something? We need a candidate. I thought back to when my wife and I decided to have kids. You know, we didn't say it out loud, but we did essentially promise our kids that we would do everything for them to make sure that we can have, or that they can have a prosperous, bright future. And given the situation that we find ourselves in as humans in this climate, I will do everything that I can for my kids. And so here I am, expressing that everything. I'll put my name forward. I'll champion the cause. I'd love to represent Peterborough, Kawartha, and strong climate policy in Ottawa.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about climate change, because right now we've got these climate rallies happening all over the world, and I think it's kind of a top-of-the-mind issue, but is that issue important enough to get a Green Party in government?
Yeah, it is important enough, right? What we're looking at, the reality of the election is we're looking to elect a minority government where Greens hold the balance of power, and this is something that we've seen in British Columbia. Where the Greens are requiring the NDP minority to cooperate, function together on condition that certain policies are followed through. And so similarly in Canada, through this election, we're looking at Green seats in Vancouver and in Ontario and in PEI. Hopefully able to hold that balance of power to promote better policy. When we have to work together, we come up with better rounded policies, better solutions when governments are cooperating. So the big issue that we're facing now, you might have heard that Canada has, as far as Greta Thunberg is concerned, that Canada is number 2 in terms of showing up per capita, for these rallies. So they estimated that 2.9% of Canadians showed up to protest the climate inaction that we've seen from our government. So that protest was lively here in Peterborough. We saw around 500 people come out last week. The week before, we had roughly 400 students. These are like high school students. It is very energizing to see people take a stand to disrupt the everyday life, to require us to think critically about what's happening around us. And the truth is that this climate change crisis that we find ourselves in is not a future issue. This is something that is happening now. We have examples of soybean pods underproducing in Ontario. We have maple syrup that's flowing a month early in the calendar year, affecting these the crop cycles, the growing periods that they have are being disrupted. And so these are crop failures in the sense that they pose a problem for the future of those crops, but they are changing the periods that they can grow. They are changing the volume at which they're producing. And these are happening locally and now due to this climate crisis that we're in. So is it enough for a Green candidate to get elected? Yeah, it's changing the conversation a lot. When I'm knocking on doors and talking to people, I hear a lot of, I want to vote Green. I'm very concerned. We're not doing enough for this climate crisis. And I would offer that the Green Party platform on dealing with the climate crisis, the targets that we've set, we're the only party that is taking this crisis seriously, like an actual crisis, like we have to do literally everything that we can, like I told my kids I would. So when I talk to people at their doors, they're saying they're very concerned that we're not doing enough, but I'm terrified of a conservative government. And what we find is that people who want to vote Green, people who want strong climate action, are also terrified of a government that does not represent them or their interests, and they are choosing to vote strategically. we talk about this strategic vote a lot. Anything but conservative, or ABC, is the kind of mantra that some people will adopt. And what that means for Greens or NDPs is that in a toss-up riding like Peterborough, people are choosing instead to vote for a party that they may not really believe in, but are at least capable of stopping a conservative election here in Peterborough. So we face an uphill battle where we have to encourage people to vote bravely. This doesn't mean that we stop being afraid of what fears us, but that we do what we have to despite that fear, right? Something that I talk to my kids about a lot is that, maybe it is scary to cross the road. That danger is real. When you cross the road, a car could hit someone, but we still have to get to school and we still have to cross the road. And so we cross the road bravely, appreciating the fear that we have, appreciating the danger that it represents to us, and still doing what we need to do. And we let the outcome be whatever it needs to be. One of the ways that we can show our growing support for Greens is by voting Green, regardless of the outcome. If our neighbors see that we're achieving a critical mass in popular vote, then we can just take it from there, right? So yes, Greens can get elected. I think that this climate crisis is putting impetus on people to vote Green, to really consider, what is the greater risk? Is it worse that we have climate inaction, or is it worse that a conservative is elected, or is that the same issue, right? So I think that we can see, we're going to surprise a lot of people, yeah.
Okay. So just on the topic of climate change and the Green Party, how do you get over the hurdle of strategic voting, especially when the Green Party has this perception that it is a single issue party? And while that single issue is an important one, what else do you have on offer that really kind of sells voters on the idea of a green government?
That's a great question, because actually even last night I met a young voter. She's 19. Her name's Lily. And I asked her how she would like to vote and what matters to her. And she says, the biggest issue by far is our climate crisis, and I'm going to vote NDP. And I thought, okay, why would you like to vote NDP? Are you concerned about how the NDP's target for for greenhouse gas emissions reductions doesn't meet the scientific need to hold at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030? And of course, I have a bit of a bigger space to dialogue with her, and the question doesn't come across quite like that. But she says, well, yes, it's not as ambitious as I would like, but the NDP has more social policy. And I thought, well, that's a neat perception, because as far as I'm concerned, and as far as our platform is concerned, actually the Green Party platform is very social, and the NDPs and I will agree hand in hand on a lot of these issues. For example, the first chapter in our platform is about true reconciliation nation to nation with Indigenous peoples. We go to great lengths to discuss how we'd like to adopt all of the calls to action from the murdered and missing Indigenous women and children, all of the calls to action from the UN DRIP. We're talking about where a nation consults us to opt out of the Indian Act. We're talking about repealing the Indian Act. And this is the first chapter of our platform, talking about social issues, talking about things like housing and affordability and national pharmacare, right? Decriminalizing possession of opioids. We're talking about a guaranteed livable income. We're talking about these social issues that are expressed in our platform that show that we have given significant thought to the issues that Canadians face. And insofar as climate change is woven throughout everything, as it's a problem that we face today, it's going to affect every policy going forward. It needs to be a part of our everyday vernacular. It's not enough just to be a climate change party, right? We did earn that reputation earnestly because we've been hammering that nail for a long time, longer than anybody. But we have made a considerable display of those social policies to make sure that this government would take care of all Canadians.
Okay. And how does that fit into, how does your social policy blend with climate change? What are some of the Una had mentioned before about how you know, many or all of the Green Party's policies have some kind of climate change angle to them. So, in what ways do your social policies blend with that?
Well, let's consider that in a world where there's increasing food insecurity, because now we can't import food, or now we can't grow food, or we experience crop failures on that kind of level, we will see that lower income families are disproportionately affected, right? If there is a drop in supply and a raise in demand, that's a raise in price. And if we can't make sure that our families are fed, if they can't afford that food because of the climate crisis that we find ourselves in, increasingly making that food insecurity a growing problem, then that's one way how we need to manage our policies regarding importing food, how we need to make sure that food is properly priced, how we need to make sure that families have an income no matter what so that they can afford that food. And those social policies reflect that future nature for our most vulnerable neighbors, right? One other thing that we can think about is, why don't you go ahead?
All right.
This train of thought has left the station.
No worries. Let's go into housing, because that's an issue that deeply affects Peterborough.
Yes.
Obviously, over the course of the summer, the housing market was highlighted to the extreme with the prevalence of tent city downtown. There's been commitments to build housing, but it's going to take a federal government's participation to make some of these things happen.
Yes.
So what is the Green Party's stance on housing? What is your platform on that topic?
Yeah. When it comes to what happened downtown at Victoria Park in Tent City and what is now essentially just across the street, is that we found that there are 50 people with unique circumstances that brought them to that place. And I asked a social worker, a friend of mine, what is the solution to this? And she says to me, there are 50 unique situations and 50 solutions that are necessary. And it's not easy, right? One of the underpinning themes in everyone's story is that there is systemic poverty that is perpetuated by, for example, if you have no fixed address, the most that you can count on for social assistance is about $380 a month. Now, I could not feed my family on $380 a month, let alone rent a place in a place where rent is increasingly expensive. So in terms of housing and Green Party platform, we need to consider this from a couple of different planks. First, we have a supply issue. We talked about how in food insecurity, sometimes the food is available, but we can't afford it. And in the same way, in Peterborough, we have a supply problem. The demand is up, the price is up. And so one of the biggest things that as a federal government we can do is to help fund building projects that are for purpose, for rent, and affordable. We would like to see, for example, a new construction project be required to have a fixed ratio of affordable housing units within it, so that we're not building large, expensive luxury condo in one building, all of these luxury condos, but by mixing the size and affordability of units, that we get a better mix, and that affordability remains.
So is that federal legislation that all housing developments have to entail a certain percentage of affordable, or is that only projects which receive federal funding?
Only the projects that would receive federal funding. Yeah.
Okay.
So something to think about is that we do want to permit free market to express itself, and if there is demand for luxury condominiums, then someone's going to build luxury condominiums. But what the federal government wants to do is to level that playing field. The Greens, we want to make sure that the affordable housing is economically incentivized, perhaps beyond what would be the return of that investment in a natural market, right? So yes, when discussing how much funding we'd like to permit, putting that caveat or putting that requirement on that project to make sure that there is a mix of affordability into there. So we've committed, for example, in our platform to 25,000 new constructions every year and 15,000 refurbished constructions every year. committing $750 million to rent assistance, as part of budgets to families to help afford those kinds of places. In Peterborough, the rent is so high that you wouldn't be able to afford the rent on minimum wage. It's just there after your rent, after your heat and hydro, and if you have kids, you're done, right? It's just there's just not enough money to afford it. So the supply issue needs to be addressed. We need to be building more units. They need to be close to existing infrastructure. We need to build upwards, for example, instead of outwards. Someone who is in affordable housing might find themselves also not able to afford transportation. So we need them close to bus routes. We need them close to bike routes. Those kinds of to help reduce the cost of living, right? So those constructions we'd like to see within existing infrastructure. So we need to address the supply issue, and then I would like to also offer that we need to address the systemic poverty, the circumstances by which people literally just can't afford things. And the way that the Greens would like to go about this is through a guaranteed livable income. We've seen through the Canada Child Tax Benefit, what used to be the baby bonus, that a guaranteed payment from government to the family is beneficial and it's affordable, and it actually increases a family's economic participation. Suddenly a family that was cash strapped now can go buy diapers and food and all of that. As a full-time dad, that payment from the federal government has been absolutely institutional. I could not have stayed at home with my kids without that. I would have had to go to work just to pay for daycare, and I would have been no further. So we want to take that model of the Canadian Child Income Tax Benefit and apply it to this guaranteed livable income. It needs to be regionally based. To live in Toronto will cost more than living in Peterborough, will cost more than living in Lakefield, and so it needs to be regionally based. And it is essentially, you're a human and a Canadian, and you have air in your lungs, and so you receive a payment from your government, so that you have always a guaranteed livable income.
So is that something that is handled in decisions that are made at a federal level, or is that something that you would pass to the provinces and say, you have to have some kind of guaranteed income program, but what that looks like is up to you, kind of like how cannabis legislation was passed? What does that look like?
So this should be a federal program. The child tax benefit is a federal program, and what this will look like is it will essentially replace a lot of social assistances. In Canada, we're already spending about $38 billion in social assistance, and the cost of guaranteed livable income has been pegged between $48 billion and $70 billion. So when we're talking about closing the gap on social assistance spending, we're not talking about a large increase necessarily. We could be, if we get up to $70 billion, then we might be in a position where that's quite expensive. But yes, it should be federal, and it will mean that, for example, ODSP might no longer be necessary. It might mean Ontario Works might no longer be necessary. And how much are we able to save on social programs by unifying them? And do we recover some of the costs of those programs by, say, transferring from ODSP or Ontario Works, right? That's in the finer details, and I'm not really sure how that portion works out in cooperation. But I'd like to offer this, that in several parts of the Green Party platform, we talk about the Canadian Council of Governments. And this is a new institution that we would like to see put in place, which involves all levels of government at the same table, coordinating to solve a problem. What this means is that your member of parliament, your member of provincial parliament, your mayor and town council, and local Indigenous governments are all sitting at the same table discussing how do we resolve housing. And the federal government can say, well, we'd like to propose a guaranteed livable income, and we would like to provide funding for construction of new projects, addressing the supply. The municipal government can say, great, because we have this project, and we're having this discussion at the table on a regular basis, right? If we can coordinate and work together, then these problems that are kind of cross-jurisdiction, is it a federal issue? Is it a municipal issue? Is it a provincial issue? Now we're working together to solve these instead of in spite of each other, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So using housing as that example, how do you do that, especially when you might have a provincial and federal government that might not necessarily be flying the same flag? So, for example, if the Green Party gets in the election, then you would have a green federal government, but then you would have a progressive conservative provincial government. And those two might be flying different opinions when it comes to dealing with issues such as housing.
I think that having differences of opinion is great and healthy for discourse. If we come to the table and first we have to all get to the table, right? All I can do is commit myself to making those meetings, and we have to permit people the choice to make their own, right? But if we're all at the table and we're agreeing and saying, look, housing is a problem, and my government is willing to do this, and the Ontario PC government is willing to do this, and the municipal government is willing to do this. Like, how do we combine our resources and coordinate this thing? Working together across party lines, across levels of government, we're going to come up with better solutions. And I can only think that it's healthy to have those kinds of discussions, even with a difference of opinion.
Okay. All right, so let's take a short break there, and we'll be right back talking about some other important issues.
All right.
Perfect. All right, so let's get back into the second half right here. And one of the important issues that, again, is affecting our community and it's taking lives is the opioid crisis.
Yes.
We have a record number of people dying due to opioids. So what is the Green Party's plan to deal with that issue?
Right. So recognizing in Peterborough the opioid crisis, the highest per capita opioid deaths in Ontario, 26 in Peterborough County at last I heard in the news. We need to do a lot, really. First and foremost, we'd like to see that opioid possession is decriminalized. Right. If someone's ready to get help, they need to be able to go and ask for that help without that fear of incarceration. We'd like to maintain a safe supply of opioids to make sure that there isn't any contamination or poisoning by fentanyl, and making sure that the opioids that we can provide are at least clean. And in our platform, we recognize that those are to be as part of a prescription in therapy, right? So if someone has asked for help, we want to have a program in place to make sure that their supply is safe, and that we are helping them to overcome that addiction, right? In our platform, we talk about housing first, as a plank in mental health and addictions. In Housing First, we want to make sure that people, no matter what circumstance they find themselves in, can always have that stability and dignity of their home. And we've talked a little bit about the guaranteed livable income. That's how we'd like our neighbors to be able to afford their homes. But when we talk about Housing First in terms of treating opioid crisis and treating mental health, someone having their home and food to eat means that the hierarchy of needs is met, right? If we're concerned about where to eat, where to live, dealing with an addiction is out of reach, right? If we can satisfy those baser concerns and be good neighbors to each other and help out that way, then suddenly tackling that addiction is a lot easier. And not to say that dealing with an addiction is easy, but that we're not also struggling for those existential issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to some of these parts of this plan that you've mentioned, you've seen people warm up to the idea of consumption sites and decriminalization. These are concepts that other parties have talked about in their platforms as well. What was interesting, and I'm hoping you can go into more detail about, was this safe supply. How would that get rolled out, and how do you deal with the perception that, oh, well, you're just giving drugs to druggies? That's not going to solve the problem.
Let's take the legalization of marijuana, for example, because within the last 2 years, our government legalized recreational marijuana. And what that meant was that you could go to a store and buy some and go home and do whatever, right? Legalizing that recreational marijuana meant that, or I should say cannabis, pardon me, meant that people were free to enjoy that in the same way that they enjoy alcohol. What we're talking about decriminalizing opioids means that this is simple possession. It means that it's not a crime to have the drug. We can't be treating this like a criminal issue. We need to be treating this like a medical issue. And the effects that this will have might be, for example, that someone who is in therapy and who has committed themselves to treating the addiction would receive a safe supply. It means that they're not beholden to a drug dealer who might have a grasp on someone's life by being the only source of that, right? And that kind of further deepens the social interaction, the social issue of it. So when we talk about providing a safe supply, it's within the context of therapy, and that needs to be underlined and underscored and highlighted in yellow. That this is it's within the context of someone saying, "I need help. How do I get off?" And if it's decriminalized, the possession, they can get the help that they need. And then they can know that the drug that they're taking is clean, and they're not further risking their life by fentanyl poisoning, which is what we see a lot of in these opioid overdoses.
So you'd mentioned decriminalization of simple possession. So how does that affect enforcement of trafficking when it comes to large amount of these drugs that are being moved around throughout our communities to be distributed? How does that affect the police's ability to crack down on that?
Well, I think you said it yourself. There's a different term. Trafficking is not the same as possession, right? And so there is a definable amount. This is not a new conversation for Canadians, right? We've been talking about cannabis and marijuana possession for a very long time. And so it needs to reflect those same kinds of principles. Someone has some to use for themselves, and someone has a lot to sell to others, and that's the difference between possession and trafficking. So in terms of police enforcement, the guidelines should easily reflect those same kinds of numbers, whether cannabis or heroin or whatever else. Yeah.
Okay. And what is your thoughts on a consumption site and or treatment center here in Peterborough?
Absolutely necessary. Yeah, we desperately need it. We need to be doing everything that we can. There is a petition being signed. They had it at there was a fundraiser for the warming room at the venue a few weeks ago. I was there, and they had a petition right at the front desk to Dave Smith to open a safe consumption site. And please, where do I sign? And can I have a copy for my own office? And so we have this petition at the Green Party headquarters. We need to be taking care of our vulnerable neighbors, and having that first step or that first contact with someone who can help. A safe injection site, of course, we're talking about our first point of contact for someone who might consider asking for help, and having that place there. Of course, we can relieve our burden on healthcare. If someone does overdose or if they're infected by a dirty needle, these are cost saving mechanisms that we can put into place, right? We don't need to burden our healthcare system with those costs if we can prevent them. So there's some economic savings to be had just by, a penny of prevention is worth a pound of cure. By espousing that principle, we can hedge some costs later down the road, but also by being there with our neighbors, we can help to influence the conversation and the direction that they're taking.
So what does that the funding for that model look like? Is that federally funded, provincially funded, locally funded, a blend of both or all three? Or
it's definitely going to be a blend. You'll find that in our platform, when we talk about addictions and mental health and the funding that's there, we're making funds available. This is definitely a provincial healthcare kind of issue, and so the province is definitely going to have money involved, and the municipality, absolutely. Peterborough recognizes that this is a problem, and you bet that they'll have funding behind it as well. And so this is the kind of issue that requires collaboration, that definitely needs all hands on deck to kind of coordinate and find that best solution. Yeah, everybody getting involved, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to this last issue here, and it's more of a social issue than anything, and that's kind of the state of politics right now. I think the last few years you can kind of easily chart and see changes in how we talk about politics, and I think politics themselves have gotten a bit more messy and a bit more personal these past few years. So I'm wondering, what is your opinion on the current state of politics, and do you have any plans to kind of rise above that messiness?
I'd like to tell you a story. At my nomination meeting, we had a contested nomination, so I was not the only one to vie for candidate. There was a gentleman, and he was not a Green Party member. Our nomination meetings are open to public, and I didn't recognize him, but he said, "I want you to tell me why I shouldn't vote for the other guy, and then you can tell me why I should vote for you." And my reaction was visceral, because I wanted to just stand up and say, "No, I'm not going to do that." And what happened? I thought I was being pretty clever, if I'm honest with myself. I stood up and I actually made the case for my other contestant, because in that space there, as contestants for the nomination, we weren't competing for the cause; we were cooperating for the cause. And what this meant was that I was able to stand and say, if you value these things, this is who Doug is. Doug is, he would make a great candidate for these reasons. And I'll offer a simple contrast. If you would prefer, this is the candidate that I am. And then I sat down. And I think that choosing not to take the bait, choosing to elevate that discussion is of absolute utmost importance. In politics in Canada, we're seeing, we're now having the discussion about casual racism. And it's due to the kind of distraction that we've been thrown, that's been thrown at us, right? We don't need to be going, 20 years into the past, where we've seen character restoration over time and apologies, where casual racism continues and persists elsewhere. So we can have a great discussion thanks to that distraction, but the caliber of discussion in politics is reflected by that kind of strategy. And I'd like to offer that so far, at the all candidates debates that we've had here in Peterborough Kawartha actually have been very positive. We have seen candidates agreeing with each other on some points. We have seen that when one candidate tried to throw shade, that nobody took the bait and they just let it stand, and there's a recoil from the audience. People don't want that anymore. They don't want to see that back and forth kind of nattering and mudslinging. Like, we're really tired of that. People want to hear why our policies are good. They want to hear what we're going to do for our kids, and they want to see our elected officials behaving like adults. So yeah, the experience up to date with my fellow candidates has been entirely positive. And I've had an opportunity to chat with just about each of them about raising the political discussion and showing some poise, and I think we're generally agreed that we all want to see that going forward. We all want to see that the caliber of discussion in politics has grown. I would like to offer that I think what we could do as a federal government to help that along is by actually talking about democratic reform. And one of the planks in Green Party platform is talking about changing the way that we elect our officials. We talk about first past the post, and we'd like to see that changed. We talk about mixed member representation, actually representing Green votes. If 10% of Canadians vote for Greens, but we capture 2% of the seats, I would say that's almost not fair, and it's undemocratic, right? So one of the things that we can do as a federal government to change the discussion of politics is to get past identity politics, to get past us and them, and to start coordinating and collaborating and working together and making sure that all of our voices are heard. So I think that changing or espousing electoral reform can have a big impact on the kinds of discussions that we have.
So how would electoral reform, changing the first past the post system, and seemingly replacing it with something else, how would that change the state of politics? How would that elevate us above kind of this messy position that we're in now?
Well, right now we do a lot of effort to vote somebody out, right? I don't want to see that candidate, so I'll vote this way. And we're talking again about strategic voting, right? When we are forced to kind of give up our voice, what we want to stand for, and instead put it behind the lesser of two evils, so to speak, when we have to deploy that kind of reasoning, we get into an us versus them, right? If we can change the way that we're electing our officials and we're no longer us versus them, we know that our voice is counted and that our vote is represented proportionally, then we don't need to us versus them. We don't need to select the lesser of two evils. We can literally always vote for what we believe in and be properly represented. And so the tactic of trying to encourage people to vote somebody out no longer works, because that's first past the post. It's definitely a symptom of that system. So by changing that, by going to some form of ranked ballot or some form of mixed member representation or proportional representation, whatever the case is, any change, really, we can get into the finer points of which one is which. But any change would be a step in the right direction. One change could lead to another change. But right now, we were promised electoral reform and it wasn't delivered. And this is particularly aggravating for a lot of voters. So I'd like to propose that we can elevate the discussion by removing the prospect of voting somebody out. And that's what First Past the Post does.
Okay. I noticed that when it comes to social media, a lot of movement in some of these climate rallies that have been happening around the world, a lot of it has been dependent on people being able to communicate and coordinate via social media.
Yes.
And it's become this great tool for being able to do that and having those conversations. The downside of that is that social media can sometimes be a very volatile tool.
Yes, it is.
Especially when you do have kind of people rallying around political sides and basically saying, well, my side is right and your side is wrong, so therefore I'm going to shout you down in the name of this politician. How do you go about dealing with that?
You know, it's tough, right? When depending on which platform you're on, if you're on Facebook, for example, you're usually dealing with someone's public profile. You know, they have their name, they've got their picture, a picture of their kid. This is a real person who's brought up a real concern. On Twitter, sometimes it's not true. Someone might have a handle or a username that doesn't reflect an actual person, and maybe there's no picture of themselves or their kids, and so you don't know who that person is. You know, they're anonymous, so to speak. You might get into, say, Reddit, where Reddit is intentionally anonymous and usernames are intended to not reflect who you are, so that it's more pure to the discussion and the point of the philosophy, instead of, you know, attaching a person to it, right? Removing the ad hominem defense altogether. So where it comes down to those platforms, one of the things that the Green Party would like to see is that anonymization removed, that social media accounts need to be linked to a real person, where vitriol and hate speech can't be removed from personal responsibility, right? We might be free to say whatever we want to a degree. We have hate speech laws in Canada, but we can't be removed from the consequences of the things that we want to say. And sometimes that means that we have to stand for account for the things that we say, and we have to. The Green Party would like to see that social media accounts are backed by a real identity, and that puts an onus on those platforms to know who is operating on their platforms. Does that mean that they have to require identification? I don't know what that means exactly, but taking the anonymity away from the keyboard warrior will go a long way in elevating that kind of discussion. If someone is responsible for the words that they say, then they might choose to say differently.
So how does that work when a lot of these social media companies are American companies that might not be susceptible to Canadian law? So how does that work?
You know, it's a good question. They are operating in Canada. Canadians are purchasing, or I should say, Canadian data is the product that they're selling, right? If you're not paying for a product or a service, you are the product or the service. So, for example, Facebook monitors your behavior and it sells aggregate data to advertisers, and that's how they perform as a business. And so Facebook is collecting Canadian data. Facebook is operating within a Canadian space. They're using our social infrastructure. They're using our telecommunications. And I would dare say they're also not paying any income tax. And so one of our major policies is to close that kind of tax loophole where they're operating in Canada but not paying an income tax on their ad revenue. That's besides the point. But what we see is that we have a slew of regulation and policy for these new businesses, because Facebook is relatively new, and our tax law hasn't been changed in very long, or since the 60s really. We need to close those kinds of loopholes. We need to make Facebook accountable to Canadian standards, to Canadian business and income and tax standards, and to code of conduct standards, right? If they are capable of operating their entire global business out of, say, Ireland, where that corporate tax is favorable to them, then we're not only are we missing out on that taxable income, but we're not able to enforce our social value. If they want to be part of the Canadian discussion, then they can play by Canadian rules. And we would have to develop that regulatory framework to make sure that they would abide by removing anonymous level vitriol kind of accounts, if that makes sense.
Okay. So I think we're out of time now, so I'll just leave it off with you. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, well, thank you very much for having me. When I think about all of the kinds of things, whether we're talking about housing or opioids or climate change, I think about my kids often. They're really the reason that I'm doing this. When I'm at Pride Parade, for example, the thought of my 20-year-old son receiving a hug from a stranger, that's a terrifying thought for my kids, and I don't want my kids to grow up in an environment that has been poisoned by big industries, that the adults that promised to protect them didn't protect for them. The reason that I am motivated to get any of this done is so that my kids have that bright future, and it's something that I'm willing to work for your kids. I don't know if you have any, or your future kids, or all of our kids, really. This is the reason why I'm in any of it. So anyways, thank you for having me.